Hello and welcome to a deck profile for the premium format. This time we're going to be talking about Narukami, specifically Eradicators. This is a deck that's historically been the king of premium. At various points, it's been the best deck undisputed in the format, but it's been hit by two different bannings in the past couple years, and so now it's kind of fallen down to almost tier 2 status, but it's still very strong, very aggressive. It draws a ton of cards, and it has some very broken effects that it has access to. So it's always worth respecting. And even after getting hit by two bannings, it's topped 6 times this year, and it has gotten first place at two different regionals in the BSF season. So it's clearly still a powerhouse of a deck. Uh, but it is a deck that comes now with a significant deck building choice that you have to make, which I'll cover as we get into the list. Let's hop straight into it. We'll start off with our grade 0 starter. This is Ambush Dragon Eradicator Linchu. Any Eradicator would be good here, but the starter honestly doesn't really matter that much. Just play a V era starter. Next up is our ride targets, and we're starting with 3 copies of Draconic Vanquisher, the G era version. We're playing this one because of the change to the history collection strides, which have the effect that if you're on grade 3 and you haven't received an imaginary gift, you can discard cards totaling to 3 to superior stride into them and then get 2 imaginary gifts. Now, as an Excel clan, we abuse the history collection stride mechanic more than any other type of imaginary gift because we get Excel 2. And Excel 2 draws a card and gives 5k. As well as counting as an extra rearguard circle for those of you who haven't played with imaginary gifts before. So this is essentially going to be a free stride. The first Excel marker will replace the cost, and then the second Excel marker will be 1 card of profit, which is really good, and it'll help us draw any combo pieces we need, or just draw more defensive shield value. Anything you need, it'll find. And Narukami can hit an absurd number of attacks. So just getting access to 2 Excel markers on turn 3 to put the pressure on our first grade 3 turn to set up for a devastating turn 4 is exactly what we want. You can play 4 Vanquisher. I personally am playing 3 because you only need to find 1 per game. But playing 4 will just make you a little bit more consistent. But this deck has a lot of ways to check the top 5 for cards. So we don't need to play 4 for this deck to function. And when you're going second, oftentimes you will choose not to ride Vanquisher because our other grade 3 can also generate 2 Excel markers when we're going second in specific circumstances. So it's not the end of the world. Next up is our primary grade 3. This is the one we're going to be on for most of the game. This is Sweep Command Dragon, the V era version. What this does is when it's placed, you Soul Blast 1, and you bind a front row rear guard on your opponent's side, and then you can move a back row rear guard to the front. And then if you bound a rear guard, you can counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, and bind another front row rear guard. And then if you're at 4 damage or more, you can make an imaginary gift Excel, and then you can call an Eradicator from your drop to that Excel marker. So this is really potent. If we're going second and we get pushed up to 4, we can go into this guy and immediately kill their front row, get 2 Excel markers, and also reanimate an Eradicator from our drop zone to immediately turn the tables on the opponent and reverse the situation. The fact that this is essentially wiping their front row every turn makes it really scary for the opponent to play against because they have to choose between committing and putting pressure on you, and then losing cards for it, or not committing and putting pressure on you, and possibly getting punished if you go into a different direction with your strides. So this card is really, really strong, and this is where the design choice comes in, because this is choice restricted with Demolition Dragon, which I will show here in a second. Demolition Dragon is Narukami's best grade 1. This has an on-hit draw card on V and on R, and then you can bind a card from their drop, and then you put this card to Soul. This is an extremely powerful effect. It builds Bind Zone very quickly, and a lot of the strides in Narukami care about the number of cards in Bind Zone. And on-hit draw is really strong, and this card excels going second as a Vanguard And having the on hit draw pressure also allows you to damage deny the opponent in unique ways where they have to choose between giving you a card, and if they don't, then you just don't attack them with the cards that don't draw on hit. And they know that you're going to do that, so they have to give you the card if they want Counterblast to function. So this card is really strong and is rightfully hit by a restriction, and you cannot play it with Sweep Command in the deck. But the problem is that playing that card means that you're kind of locked into playing some mediocre strides. Sweep Command is the only card that enables our best stride, which is Exterminate Dragon, which I'll get to when we talk about the G-Zone. But this is the only stride we have that's viable right now because we're restricted to one copy of Stunverse as well. And Stunverse is really powerful, but having only one copy of it means that when we play the other main grade 3, Vowing Saber Reverse, we can't generally wipe the front row to get access to Exterminate Dragons plus 20k to the front row with this card. We really only can synergize this with Stunverse. And only one Stunverse means we get like one good shot at killing the opponent. And if we don't kill them, then our deck kind of doesn't have anything to do. And that's really awkward. And if we can't build Bind, Stunverse also isn't very powerful. It's still decent. It's still one of the best strides ever printed. But it's not as good as it could be. And it's sometimes not enough to keep up with the format. So you have to choose between having your best stride and your best grade 3, or having your best grade 1 and having a mediocre grade 3, the one with still a still very powerful effect, although one that's harder to pull off, and having to play a package of weaker strides because you have to play the Vanquisher strides, which are decent but require you to scale off the bind zone. And again, there are ways for your opponents to counter this, to get rid of their bind zone and shuffle it back into or put it into the drop zone. Specifically in Grand Blue and Mega Colony, I think, are the two clans that can do it, which are two decks you really don't want to lose to. So you gain some consistency problems, you lose access to your best grade 3, but you get the best grade 1 in the clan, or you can sacrifice the best grade 1 in the clan to get the best grade 3 and the best stride. Personally, I sacrificed the best grade 1 to get access to Sweep Command and Exterminate Dragon. And the lists that have gotten first place this season have made the same choice. So I think that's the choice that you should make too. Setting that aside, we can now go to our grade 3, our search target package for Forbidal. So Forbidal is an order from Standard that lets you search for either 2 grade 3s or grade 3 and a grade 4, and you call the grade 3s and you can add the grade 4 to hand. So we're playing a copy of Virina Esperidia. This is a restander for Soul Blast 1 when your Vanguard attacks, and we can only call it when we are on a stride because that's the only time we're on grade 4. And then we have Black Arrow Dragon, which turns off auto abilities when it attacks if it's on an additional R. That's a sneakily powerful effect because a lot of Perfect Guards only gain the Can't Be Hit effect as an auto ability, and a lot of G Guardians only get their powerful effects as part of an auto ability. So turning those off greatly restricts the opponent's ways to guard and gives you a nice target to sink all your triggers on to try to one-shot kill the opponent. And this card isn't very commonly played, so a lot of times people misunderstand what it does. Your opponent will pick up this card, read it, put it back down, and then try to perfect guard it later in the turn. That has happened to me multiple times in regional tournaments, so I can guarantee you it'll happen for you as well, basically. So it's worth considering. You can also play, if you don't want to play Black Arrow Dragon, you can consider Krumstego. This is a card that Soul Blast 1 and binds 3 from the opponent's drop zone when it attacks, and then if they can't bind 3, you get plus 10k. So it gets a big number, and it also helps fuel the bind zone for some of your powerful late game strides. So that's a valid option to consider, but I personally like this one more. And the Virina Esperidia is mandatory. You must play one copy of this. Next up is our grade 2s, and we're starting with 4 copies of Spark Raised Dragon. On place, this gets 5k, and you check the top 5 for an Eradicator, add it to hand, and then discard a card. Just a solid way to smooth out your draws and dig for sweep commands. And then it has on hit Soul Blast 1 draw card on V and R. So this is a mandatory 4 of, especially since we had to cut Demolition Dragon. This gives us back some of our on hit pressure. And it's just a great way to spend soul. It really makes the opponent think twice about guarding or not guarding. It's an excellent card. Next up we have Zuiton. Yeah, Zuiton. This is a grade 2 that puts itself to soul and draws a card when your opponent has no front row. That's all it's there for. We can't use the other effect. And then next we have our Restander grade 2 Cho-O. When your opponent has no front row, this restands for Counterblast 1 at the end of the battle your Vanguard attacked. And then it also can Counterblast 1 and bind a front row rear guard and move something from the back row to the front if you want. So this is just a great way to get some additional pressure. We put this on an Excel 2, and you're swinging for 14 and then restanding and swinging for 14 again. Uh, it's a really solid card, and the fact that it's a counterblast and Virene is a soul blast means that we have two different ways to restand in the deck off of two different resources. Next up is our grade 1s, and we're starting with 4 copies of Mighty Bolt Dragoon. This is a top 5 checker for grade 3, and you add it and discard a card, and then it gets 5k if you bound a card this turn. Just typical V era grade 3 searcher. Really solid card. Scales well with the Excel markers because it'll go up to 18, and then with Exterminate Dragon it'll be 38. And then we have Nusku. This is a grade 1 that checks the top 5 for an Eradicator, adds to hand, and then you discard a card. Just a way to find all of the good Eradicators in our deck, because the majority of our deck is Eradicators. Yeah, not much else to say about it. Just smooths out consistency, and any attacker is at least a 13 if you put it on an Excel 2. And then next we have Chain Bolt Dragoon at 4 copies. This is what we've replaced Demolition Dragon with. This will check the top 7 for a Vanquisher, and then if you bind this card from hand during your turn, you may call it to R, but that's basically never going to happen. We are not playing the Vanquisher package to pull that off, so this is just to check top 7 for our Vanquisher to make sure we can History Collection Stride going first. And any additional Vanquishers we find with this card, we can just discard to pay for costs. So it'll help thin our deck, it'll help us pay for costs, and it'll help us always consistently curve out and get our best turn 3 play. And then 1 copy of Elementaria, the best perfect card in Premium. Yeah, mandatory inclusion in basically every deck. And then next we have our heals. For the grade 3 heal, we want to stride every time we're legally allowed to, and this has a good anti-aggro effect of gaining 10k or giving -2 crit to the attacker. Really solid. Next is our crits. We have 4 stride crits. Again, we want to stride as much as possible. And then we have 4 of the History Collection draw crits. These are the best crit defensively. They draw a card, and they've been updated to be 10k power and 15k shield. And then we have 3 draw PGs because we're playing an Elementaria, and then 1 copy of the Dragon Empire Overtrigger, Drag Veda. We don't actually have that great a Vanguard at any given point, but just getting 3 more drive checks is always good. It's always going to be really solid. That's the main deck, so let's get to the G-Zone. We have 2 copies of Zoras. This is the History Collection Stride updated. Its on hit is you retire a rear guard from your opponent's side and then bind 2 cards on their drop. So it'll help fuel the bind zone for effects later in the game. It'll make 2 Excel markers. It does everything we want. And then next we have 3 copies of Exterminate Dragon. 9 times out of 10, this is what you're going to stride into anytime after turn 3. On place, you Soul Blast 1 and you draw a card for every open front row circle on the opponent's side. So usually 2, sometimes 3, 4, or 5, depending on if they're playing an Excel clan. And then for Counterblast 1, you give your front row 10k for every open circle in their front row. So usually plus 20, but sometimes plus 30 or 40, depending on the matchup. Really solid. It takes all these small bad numbers, like these 9Ks and 8Ks, and turns them into magic numbers of 28s and 29s and 33s and 38s, which makes the massive number of attacks we have really hard to guard and makes most of them hit over defensive. So this combined with potentially 4 Excel markers on turn 4. If we go History Collection Stride turn 3, we get 2. And then if we go Sweep Command at 4 damage, we get another 2. So that's potentially 7 attacks. And then we have Restanders, so any Counterblast can turn Cho-Os into more attacks. Any Soul can turn the Virena into another attack. We could potentially be looking at 10 attacks or more. all with plus 20,000, which is really, really difficult for any deck to survive. Your opponent's main out is to guard really aggressively early and then hope they hit double defensive on turn 4. And hope they hit heals or hit the overtrigger or something. Next up is Stunverse. This is one of the most powerful strides ever created. It's a bit less strong in our deck because we're not playing Vowing Saber Reverse. What this does is you Soul Blast 1, turn a card from the G Zone face up, and put this card from V back into the G Zone. And then you bind 4 rear guards on the opponent's side and 4 cards from their drop. And then for every 4 cards in the bind zone, they bind 1 from hand and you draw a card. So if they had a full board and 4 cards in the drop, you're at the very least binding 2 cards from their hand and drawing 2 cards, because they'll have 8 in the bind. But if you're able to fuel the bind zone with any of your other effects and get that number up to 12 in bind after activating this, that's draw 3 and bind 3 from them. And that means you can get to really scary numbers with Stunverse in the late game. You could potentially make your opponent get rid of half their hand or more. It's a really strong effect, but we can only play 1 because it's been limited to 1. So you'll go into it every now and then. I should mention there's also a very funny going second play you can do. If you're on Vanquisher specifically, and you're going second, what you do is you stride into Stunverse, and then you activate Stunverse's effect, put it in the G Zone, do the thing, bind 4 cards on their drop, bind 4 rear guards, and then bind cards on their hand, and you draw cards. And then you can activate the History Collection stride in your main phase, because you have not received an imaginary gift yet, and you'll be back on a Vanquisher Vanguard. And then you'll get the access to this, you'll get 2 Excel markers, you'll draw 2 cards, and then you'll be able to get the on-hit, retire, and bind something, and bind 2 cards on the drop. Really strong combo going second that you should always have an eye out for, though it will spend your Stunverse for its lowest possible value for that game. That's not the end of the world, because we're relying on Sweep Command for the most part. Or Sweep Command and Exterminate for the most part. And then next we have Fulgurate. This card has Thunderstrike X. Turn a card from the G Zone face up, discard a card from the hand, and then choose any number of your opponent's rear guards as the number of face-up cards in your G Zone. Bind them, and then all your units get plus 1,000 for every card in their bind zone. And then if their bind zone is 7 or more, this gets drive plus 1, and if it has 10 or more, it gets crit. So you go into this. Oh, sent the card flying. 1 second. So you go into this in the late game to get a Vanguard with extra drive and extra crit, and potentially wipe the opponent's board. Just a decent option to go into when you're unable to ride a Sweep Command for whatever reason, so you can't kill their front row. So you go into this, and you just try to kill as many of their units as you can. Next, we have the Progenitor Dragon for Dragon Empire. This has you have to stride into it by discarding a card with the same name as your Vanguard, and then it has Counterblast 2, Soul Blast 1. It attacks the entire board, and every time it hits, you countercharge 1. And then you'll have free stride for the rest of the game. Just a decent option to go into. If you're stuck on Vanquisher and you can't go into Sweep Command, you can at least wipe the opponent's board and get countercharge to refund the cost. Does it do anything else besides? Yeah, it also gets plus 10,000. That's the other thing it does. And the next we have Closer Dragon. This is our GBH stride. This one's pretty powerful. When it's placed on V, you retire all rear guards and bind all cards in your opponent's drop zone. And then until end of turn, you get a continuous V skill. All your units get plus 2k for every card in all fighters' bind zones. So that's going to count both players' bind zones, and generally your opponent's bind zone is going to be much bigger, especially since you're binding their entire drop. This is going to hit astronomical numbers, giving potentially plus 30 or plus 40 to your board, and then you call a full board as much as you can, and then the opponent's just dead. And then next up we have our G Guardians. I'll lay all of them out at once because they are a package and should be considered together. And then 1 copy of Harmonics Messiah, because every deck plays Harmonics Messiah. To start off, we have our MP Dragon. This is a really strong G Guardian. What this does is you turn another G Guardian face up for GB1, and your opponent retires a rear guard and then binds it face up. And if the number of your rear guards is less than your opponent's rear guards by 2 or more, they choose another rear guard and retire it. So you in Magic the Gathering terms, this would be what we call an edict effect, where the opponent chooses one of their own units to kill. Uh, but this can really hamper the opponent's game plan because if, let's say, they have 2 columns with a booster and you use this on the first attack, then they have to choose between losing the booster for this attack to make the attack not hit, or losing the other attacker, or losing the other attacker's booster, which will then make it easier to guard. And then if you have like no board at all in play, which you can pull off with this deck sometimes, you'll be able to potentially kill another unit. And so you can hard punish them for calling a bunch of units. You'll build 1 card into Bind Zone with this. And if you want to play it, there's the first Draco Kid card, which when you retire in your opponent's battle phase, lets you check the top 7 for a Sweep Command Dragon and write it. And you can do this combo with that to get a Vanguard rewrite in the opponent's battle phase, and then potentially kill their front row with Sweep Command's effect. And also, changing Vanguards means that the original attacking unit is gone and it ends the attack. And then next we have Bulwark Dragon. This has Thunderstrike 3, it gets 10k shield. Thunderstrike is how many cards are in the bind zone. And then when it gets retired from Guardian, so at the end of the battle it guarded basically, you choose a resting rearguard and retire it for every 4 cards in the opponent's bind zone. So if you can get their bind zone to 8 and you use this on the second rearguard attack, you can potentially wipe their front row. And this is really strong against restanding rearguards. So if you're playing against something like Regalia and you have a big bind zone on the opponent's side, you can potentially wipe all their restanders and stop them from getting their full combo turn. Or against Shiranui, you can potentially kill both the restanders when they go for before they can go for their Vanguard swing. It's a really strong effect. And then lastly, we have Counteract Dragon, which gives the opponent the choice of binding a front row rearguard, and if they don't, it gets 10k shield, and then they can choose that again. So usually your opponent's going to choose to bind nothing, and this will be a plus 20k shield for like 35 shield, which is a really good value for discarding 1 heal trigger. That is the G Zone. And the game plan for this deck is pretty simple. Generally speaking, we're trying to get a board state where we have 2 to 4 Excel markers on turn 4 after having used Vanquisher. We're going to ride a Sweep Command to get access to these next 2. So we're going to try to go up to 4 damage on purpose on our opponent's first turn 3. And then we're going to try to call any number of Eradicators from drop, or any of the good Eradicators from drop for a Sweep Command's effect. And then we're going to go into our Exterminate Dragon. We're going to draw 2 cards off of this. And then before we activate Exterminate Dragon's second effect, we're going to try to get a full board. So we will call literally any units we have into play. I'm just throwing out cards here to try to demonstrate what a board might look like. You will call even grade 1s to the front row if you have to, because you're going to give a huge boost. But a board often will look like something like this, where we have restanders on Excel markers, an on-hit draw effect boosted with a big booster, and then whatever we have in our hand called to the additional Rs. And then you'll activate the Vanguard skill, Counterblast 1. Everything will get, on average, plus 20. And then you'll swing with your restanders, because the restanders will restand when the Vanguard attacks. So this would be a 38. This would be a 34. And then you swing with the Vanguard. Counterblast, restand this. Soul Blast 1, restand this. And you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 attacks. And that's not even with the highest possible power ceiling. We could have drawn more copies of Cho-Oh to make that even bigger. And all of these are hitting for the 30s or higher. So all of these are over 2-card guard numbers. So the opponent has to spend 2 cards minimum, sometimes 3 cards for some of these. And the sheer number of attacks here means that perfect guards also are not as good, because a perfect guard is going to cost them 2 cards to guard 1 thing. And they're just going to run out of cards. The opponent often will physically not have enough cards in hand to guard all this, and they will have to start taking hits. So you want to play this deck super aggressively, push them as hard as you can, and then go into Exterminate Dragon and exterminate them. And even a mediocre set of drive checks isn't going to matter that much because the raw power here doesn't come from triggers, it comes from the sheer number of attacks and the fact that they're all a good number because of Exterminate's effect. So this is a deck that actually does pretty well even with bad trigger variants. So if you're a guy who doesn't trigger sack your opponents ever and you're tired of losing, this is a good deck to pick up because you can hit 0 triggers and still win with Narukami. Uh, as a free little tidbit here, I'll show you what this board would look like if you were playing the other version of this deck, where you were playing the package with Vowing Saber Reverse. So instead of this, you'll have a Vowing Saber Reverse. In order to use this effect, you'll either need a second one in Soul or a second one on R, so let's try calling one over here. In this case, we also have Demolition Dragons, so let's assume that we have a Demolition Dragon behind the Vanguard, and let's say a Demolition Dragon over here instead of this Eradicator. But aside from that, we can make use of the exact same board state. In this case, instead of going into Exterminate Dragon, we would go into Stunverse Dragon. Stunverse Dragon will then Soul Blast 1 and put itself back in the G-Zone, and we'll turn a card from the G-Zone face up, and then we'll choose 4 of the opponent's rear guards and 4 cards from drop and bind them. And then they'll bind cards from hand. Let's say they bind 2 cards from hand, and we draw 2. In this case, Vowing Saber Reverse has a very devastating effect. What it does is every time the opponent binds a card other than from their deck, they search their deck for up to 1 card with the same name as the card they bound. When they bind a normal unit, When they bind a normal unit other from deck, they can search their deck for a normal unit with the same name and bind it. If they do, you choose one of your units and give it 5k. And if they don't, it gets 10k instead. So in the event that the opponent searches for the maximum number of cards for every card you bound from their drop, from their hand, and from their rear guards, if you got the full 10 card bind there, and they bound an additional copy of all 10 of those cards, you're still getting 10 instances of 5k. So you're going like 5k here, 5k here, 5k here, 5k here, 5k here, 5k here, and then you still have 4 more to go. So then you're putting more on the restanders, and you're just making your board absolutely gigantic. Then, when this unit attacks, if you have one or more cards with Vowing in its card name in Soul or on R, you counterblast Soul Blast 1 and stand a rear guard. But if you have 4 more cards in your damage zone, you stand your entire board, except for the Vanguard. So you would be getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then swing, counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, restand everything, and you'd get 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 attacks. You'd get even more attacks with the same number of Excel markers, and you don't need to draw restanders for this combo. But the downside is you can only do it once, because Stunverse is limited to 1. So you get 1 good turn with this, and then every turn for the rest of the game, you're forced into one of your mediocre stride options. You can either go into the Vanquisher strides, which all give additional power, or the main one gives additional power for the number of cards in the bind zone, and then turns a copy of itself face up in order to when the attack hits, you choose 2 cards on the opponent's drop zone, bind them face up, and then it also has GB3. All your front row units get plus 3k for each card in the opponent's bind zone. So you go into this after you've kind of wasted your Stunverse and you don't have anything else to go into, and you hope that their giant bind zone scales well. I mean, we got 10 cards in bind off that play, in theory, if they had a full board and 4 cards in drop. So that would be, plus 30 to your front row minimum, but probably more than that because your History Collection stride binds, your Demolition Dragons bind, so it's probably a little bit better. And then you have this other one, which is very funny. You have Vanquisher VMAX, which says GB3 Counterblast 2. At the end of the battle, this unit attacked. If your opponent has no rear guards, you pay the cost. And if you do, you deal a damage. And it doesn't have the clause that your opponent has to be at 4 or less damage, like most of these effects have. So this can just deal the 6 damage and finish the opponent off, if I remember correctly. I don't believe it's been eroded. And then when this unit attack hits a Vanguard, you choose one of your opponent's R for each face-up card with Vanquisher and its card name, or when it attacks a Vanguard, not hits. You choose a face-up R, a card for R card for every face-up Vanquisher, and then this unit battles both the Vanguard and all the chosen units. So you go into this in the super late game after you've used this Vanquisher. So you have 1, 2, uh, 2 Vanquishers out max, like minimum, and then this swings in, and you can turn a Vanquisher face up with Stunverse as well. So you can be attacking 3 different rear guards, and potentially if your opponent doesn't have a very well developed board because you've been killing other stuff with your Narukami effects and with your MP dragons and bulwark dragons and whatever, you can potentially just deal free damage to them and win the game. That's like the main difference between the two is access to the Vanquisher Strides and access to that really devastating second Stunverse combo. Whereas this version of the deck is more consistent and gets a more consistent Exterminate Dragon combo, which is hitting comparable numbers, but is drawing more cards and can do so every single turn of the game after turn 3, whereas the Stunverse version can only do it once. But that's the deck. That's really all there is to it. You just make really wide boards with lots of Excel markers, and you just relentlessly attack the opponent while killing all their units every single turn. This is a really scary deck to play against, and my advice if you play against Narukami is to try to guard early and then hope you hit defensives on their stride turns. That's really the only thing you can hope for. Yeah, that's the deck in a nutshell. You will probably still see people trying to play this, so you need to be on your toes for it if you're not going to play it yourself. And if you do want to play it yourself, I think it's still fine. Even after getting hit by 2 different bannings, you can still take this deck to a regionals and get first place, as evidenced by the 2 people who did so this season. With that, as always, I hope this was informative and educational, and good luck card fighting.